everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Katie Shanka, and I'm the Parent Education Chair of the Regents Parent Fellowship. On behalf of RPF, I would like to welcome you to our first parent education session in our series called Shepherding Your Child. Through this series, we hope to provide encouragement and information to the parents of Regents in raising our children together in the Lord. We look forward to exploring more topics of interest during this series, such as discipline, the spiritual head of the home, and helping our kids learn to manage their money well. Doug is lined up to speak in March, and Chris Atwell will be speaking in May. We look forward to the wisdom that these members of our community will bring us, starting with Lindsay tonight. Tonight, Amy will be speaking on classical education and how it affects the whole child, body, mind, and spirit. Amy Lindsay is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Regents. She served as a third grade teacher as well as the Latin A teacher in the 2013-14 school year. Amy received a Bachelor's of Art in English with a focus in comparative literature and a minor in Latin from George Mason University. During her time there, she worked at the university's Writing Center and led an organization that aided international students studying English by providing weekly meetings to practice their speaking skills. After college, she taught 3rd and 6th grade at her former elementary school, Dominion Christian School, a classical Christian school in Oakton, Virginia. Throughout college, Amy worked as a teacher's aide, helping in kindergarten and 2nd grade. She also taught 1st grade as a long-term substitute teacher. She had the unique opportunity to teach Latin 1 at her alma mater, Ad Fontes Academy in Centerville, Virginia, working with students in grades 6 through 11. Amy has been involved in classical education since the age of 7, when her mother helped found Dominion Christian School. We're so grateful that Amy is giving her time to us tonight and look forward to hearing her insight into the beauty of classical education. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Gotta make sure I'm mic'd up properly here. Makes speaking a lot of fun to have a microphone of some kind. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it's January, it's cold, and it's already dark, so if you're like me, you probably want to already be in bed. So thank you for coming out. It is the first of a series that we hope to begin to cultivate a community of learning. And that kind of begins with the leadership, with our board, with Courtney, myself, and also our teachers. And we need to include parents in that if we're truly going to be a place where learning can occur. We want everyone involved. It's not just for students, it's a community of education, of learning with one another and challenging one another, spurring one another on to good things. So I'm excited about what this represents, what it will be as we continue, and what this night holds for the future. So thank you all for being a part of that and for growing this learning community that we do want here at Regents. I'm personally very excited about that. For this particular session, I do want to focus us on classical and Christian education and how Regents fits that. So I don't want to just give you an analytical perspective on that this evening, but I also want to give you a personal perspective. Having been in this position now as one who's here to help mold the culture and curriculum of a classical Christian school, and also as one who was personally molded by the culture and curriculum of a classical and Christian school. As someone who went through that, I understand what it's like to be a student in a small, growing school, what those growing pains look like, the fears and the failures that kind of coincide with those growing pains. And I also know, from a student's perspective, what that does for you as a person. It grows you personally and spiritually in a way that maybe other experiences don't. And it's because of those experiences that I'm here, that I'm back at this classical Christian school. For you see, I think what we need to focus on is that education, in its truest sense, must be about the leading of a person from those ways which seem right to a man and in the end lead to death, to a knowledge of the Holy One, which we know is true understanding. And that's what we want for our students. That's what this is about. Now, before we can continue, we have to define our terms as we tell our logic school students. We must know what we mean by classical and what we mean by Christian, right? So I'm going to define classical for you in a historical sense this evening, because I think we're fairly familiar with what we consider the trivium, the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric. We have some familiarity as a community already with those pillars of the classical model. So instead of emphasizing what those look like in their essential basis, I want to focus our conversation instead on where it's been and where it's going as a model. So when we say the term classic, immediately what comes to mind is Greek and Roman. You'd be correct to have that image in your mind. It originated in the Greek and Roman culture, but when it was in Greece and Rome, we have to imagine what it looked like. It was usually an individual teacher, more of a tutor, with a small group of students teaching them one-on-one. It was a small percentage of the population who came to school, could afford it, really. That's why we have the term a liberal arts education, because it's that percentage of the population that could afford a liber, a book. It's where it comes from. So it was really an education about books. And since we're talking about Christian perspectives, we have to discuss what worldview it started with, a humanist one. It was about cultivating oneself to promote your family, to promote your state, and ultimately the person, the self. That's what it was about. And then we have this wonderful point in time when something new happens coming out of Israel. There's this new kind of small cult, as they saw it, that kind of spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire, known as Christianity, and it grew, and it became a major part of the culture, especially when you have an emperor like Constantine who comes to power and professes that he himself is a Christian. So then you have this culture that has been pagan for a long time, and it's introduced to the truth of Christianity, and they're still being educated with the classical model. So you have people like St. Augustine who come along, and who was a renowned rhetorician in his own right before he became saved. And he thought, how can we redeem this model? There are some really wonderful things here. How can we redeem that? So he wanted to take what he had been taught, this rhetoric, and take it and make it Christ-centric instead of self-centric, and kind of turn it on its head. And that's kind of where the classical model went. And it carried on through the medieval ages. And it stayed that way, where it became an education for love of others and for service of the population around them. And this is also the time when that term trivium was coined. So it was at this time when they began discussing the trivium arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So this is kind of the second major update of what classical education looks like. And then in the last half century, there's been some growth of classical education, and then it fell a little bit. And in about the 1940s, Dorothy Sayers, a professor, comes along, gives a speech that we now read as an article titled "The Lost Tools of Learning." And in it, she kind of gives classical education a little bit of a facelift, if you will. And she talks about it as matching the developmental stages that a person goes through. So it's the first time that the trivium from the medieval ages is lined up with ages. So grammar matching those younger years, logic the middle, rhetoric the upper. And the beauty of that is, as time has gone on and our science is kind of catching up with what we have thought for thousands of years, has been confirmed that we know that the developmental progression of the brain really encourages that learning of concrete facts to the abstract evaluation of a matter, because the brain develops from back to front. I could get into the myelin coding, but we have doctors here, so I'm not going to do that to myself. So when we discuss classical, we're talking about this model that is quite ancient, but yet also modern, supported by this scientific evidence. And as rich and as glorious as this history is, and as beautiful as it is with it being supported by science, I think the real beauty of this model lies in the fact that it invites us ad fontes, to the sources. It invites us to a conversation. It invites us to go back in time with other thinkers that have lived previously, to consider what was said by people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Galileo, Archimedes. My personal favorite, Virgil. I mean, it's a beautiful thing that you're invited to in this model. Now, how do we define and kind of find the relationship between this classical and Christian? Now, there are certain pitfalls of the classical model that the Christian worldview kind of curtails. Because ultimately, the classical model, like any model apart from a Christian worldview, leads ultimately to worship of the self. And when you combine it with that Christian worldview, it doesn't just leave us at inviting us ad fontes, it invites us ad fontem, to the source, the author and the creator of it all. The goal of education at that point becomes something which the Roman rhetorician Quintilian in the 1st century stated the goal of education ought to be: a good man speaking well. So then each aspect of the trivium acknowledges its origin in its creator. Each pillar and each subject becomes a lens through which we learn about and understand the nature of our God. If we simply teach students to learn and to be lifelong learners, as is often stated the goal of education to be, we have failed. Another education can do just as well. Instead, I propose that what we would rather have is students who love the Lord first, seek to love others second, and hopefully win them over to the kingdom, and to love knowledge third. We must have our priorities. If we truly are proposing a Christian education, they must have their right place. Now, when we discuss and propose a certain model, there are certain questions that pull at us and that kind of rancor within the soul, especially when it deals with children, your beloved, that you're caring for. You wonder, can't other schools accomplish the same outcome? And aren't there aspects of such an education that students will miss out on? Aren't there things missing, like technology, sports? I've heard social skills thrown out there, so hopefully not those. For the first question, Can another school achieve the same outcome? Yes, I think so. I can't deny that fact. I have seen students come from other schools who love the Lord and serve him well. Many of you came from other types of schools, and yet here you are. You're loving the Lord and you're serving him well in what you're doing. But this method of a classical Christian education is time-tested, it's scientifically supported, and it has its foundation on biblical principles. So consider with me for a moment the proverb that says, "Teach up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not stray from it." It's not a promise. It's not a guarantee. But it's pretty good that there's a good chance that would occur. And that's what this offers. That through this training, your child will know the way in which he should go when he is old, so that when he is older, he will not stray from it. No, I can't promise that to you. But there's a good chance that your child will know the way to go by the end of such an education. Now, for the second question about missing out on certain aspects of life, modern technology, sports, and the like, I'd like to offer a little bit of a personal perspective. Having gone through this myself, being at a small school that grew similar to this one, I know that Katie mentioned I grew up in a school that my mother helped start, and it stopped at 6th grade at the time, and then I transferred to Adfantes for 7th through 12th grade. And Adfantes at the time was just that upper school, 7th through 12th, and it was small, maybe about 40 students when I was there. So if you can imagine, as I grew into this education and was there for a time, I'd like to paint a picture for you of a typical sort of situation we had. Maybe a room, maybe about half this size, with kind of 8-foot tables in a U shape, U formation. And we would have biology in there. That was mostly reading. It was pretty dry and boring. And we were able to dissect maybe 3 or 4 specimens that year. And when we did, we had to clean up the specimens afterwards, and in the very next period, eat lunch there. You can imagine. There was not a lot of technology. We didn't have a fancy lab. Now, to get away from a little bit back in my day, so that's not the tone that we have here, chemistry was very similar. It wasn't terribly engaging. We didn't have a great technological system that we were able to learn from. And yet, 3 out of the 9 students in my graduating class went on to study in scientific fields. One of them even received a scholarship to a tech school. We didn't have the technology, and yet we had success. Now, let me clarify something. Labs and technology are wonderful things. We would love to have them. If you want to write a check tonight, you can make it out to Regents School, Charlottesville. It's not that we're opposed to those things, but we don't have them right now. And what I want to tell you this evening is it's not necessary to the success of a person that wants to go into those fields. Those same classmates that I told you about, one of them now works as an engineer at Boeing, and one as a physicist at the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. They're successful in their fields, and yet that was their science that they had. And I'd like to propose that they were not exposed to great technology, but they were exposed to great thinking. Because of this model, they knew how to learn about new technology, which actually I think is quite a good skill to have in this world where technology and science is ever changing. even if they had had the technology in high school, chances are by the time that they were out in the workforce, they would have had to relearn some of the things that they had learned back then because it had changed so much in such a short amount of time. Now, on to the next sort of issue after addressing technology, sports. Sports are important. They educate the body, they build up the character through that camaraderie and competition. They're wonderful. I really enjoyed playing sports through high school, but we were not good. In fact, I think my senior year of high school, we might have won a game in soccer. So we had a lot of fun, but we were not good. The guys' team, though, that year in soccer did come in second place in our little league. And it was a small success for us, but it was tangible to the culture of the school, just that little bit of success. And 5 years later, after we had graduated, we even had from the same little school a student go to college on a basketball scholarship. They didn't own their own facility. They didn't have their own courts, even when this student went off to college for a basketball scholarship. It was a small little beginning that turned into something tangible, a little bit better for students further on down the line. And it took parents who were willing, like my own, to send their children to a school so that successful teams could be built for sports. Now, sending me wasn't a great success for those sports, but other students to help build up those teams so that there could be successes in sports. It took taking a chance and leaving it and letting it be. Now, to talk about the thing that I really love this evening, as much as I love classical Christian education, I love talking about Regents as a classical and Christian school and how it fits into this model that I've described to you, with all of its possible pitfalls and all of the possible errors that this model could offer. I think that we look tonight at Regents, and it's a beautiful example of what I've described tonight. And I have such great hope for this school that's only in its 5th year. So how is it classical? Think you could come and see our grammar students on any recitation Friday, chanting and or saying those Bible memory verses, that memorization aspect. The history songs that perhaps you have heard sung in the car that the students can't get out of their heads. The math facts that they have to memorize to the level of automaticity. We do all of this so that it can be stored properly in the brain so that when they are older and we're asking them to do some comparisons and analyzing, there's space in the brain to do that kind of work. And I think you see that at Regents through the activities that we require of our younger students. In the logic grades, we're working with comparisons on charts, relating things one to another, those things that they learned in the younger grades. Just today, I was in a Bible class with the 8th grade, and they were having a discussion on sin, its existence in the world, and how a good God could allow sin to exist. What's the relationship? How do these things coexist, a good God and a sinful world? It's the sort of thing that we're asking our logic students to do. It's heavy lifting thinking, but they're doing the work that at this age is appropriate, comparing things and relating them one to another. In our rhetoric school, we practice Socratic seminars, these discussion times. We allow them to ask questions that consider ideas that they learn and how they apply to the world around them. Today we had a seminar where the students analyzed an article that discussed literature and how it was a way that people are welcomed and drawn back to God. And they analyzed it, and they questioned it. They applied it to what they knew and questioned, is this what we know to be true? Is this what we have experienced in the books that we have read? Of the literature that we know, does this hold true? And so they're doing that sort of thinking at this level. So yes, Regents is applying that classical model. But is it Christian? You all hope so, right? As good as this education that I've just laid out for you may be, that we're teaching students how to learn, if we aren't training the heart, all of our efforts are futile. So before I answer whether or not Regents is Christian, I want to ask you questions and question you about a Christian education. Is Regents a place where the gospel is presented regularly? As in, does your child know that he or she is a sinner and needs a savior? And does your child know that there is a God who so loved them that he sent his only son to die on a cross for them, a sinner? Luke 6:40 tells us that a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Are the teachers here people you want your children to emulate? Let me answer these questions for you. I'm not going to give you any more time. Yes and yes. I do believe so. I do believe that this is a place where you will regularly see the gospel preached to children, where teachers will take the time to address heart issues one-on-one with your children. The lesson will stop so that any heart issues can be addressed when they arise. And it's not about behavior here. We're not about correct behavior, but we're about right hearts. Are they in the right place? Do they have the right position regarding God and man? Particularly, I think of our logic school and rhetoric school, where education is about discipleship, essentially, in those years. Yes, those sweet younger years in the grammar school, those teachers are with your children regularly and training them. But in the older years, it really does become a discipleship model. And you want people who love the Lord first and their subjects second, training your children. I think we have those types of teachers here, that they are doing just that they care first about the Lord and their subjects second. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been to basketball games or volleyball games or other events, but we have teachers that go. It's not enough that they spend 50, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week putting together lessons, grading, following up on emails, any of the like. But they also want to be part of your children's lives because they know it's about relationship. They need to invest in that time. They care. Because we can't get at the heart if there's not relationship there. And so they invest in that time, getting to know your children. We want to win your children's affections, not just their minds. Another example we have of this, I'm going to brag on Miss Campbell for a moment. We had a paper in the rhetoric school that did not go very well. Miss Campbell had me read these papers with her, and we both saw very clearly that this was work that was not done to the glory of God, that it was done to what they thought was good enough for man, and that was very apparent. So we had a conversation with them, paused, took a whole class, talked to them about their hearts, because this work is reflection of the heart. It's not about grades. We do care about those things too, right? But it's ultimately about your relationship with the Lord first. If you don't produce work that's honoring to Him, it's not good enough. So what she did, she stopped. She said, we have to go back. It's not just enough that I gave you a grade, and yes, I did give you a grade on this. But we need to go back and we need to master it together, and we need to honor God with our time and with our energy and our efforts. So, are we doing these things at Regents? Yes, I think that we are. I think that you can be confident of that. If you ever want to speak further about that, I would be happy to meet with any of you to discuss what we're doing here at Regents, because I am that confident about it. I'll wrap up here to state that no, Regents is not a perfect school. It never will be so here on earth. But it is certainly a classical Christian school. It's a place where your child is loved and where they're taught as a whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Thank you all for coming out this evening.